Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is a system that's made up of mostly used parts and it cost me around £250 to £300. This is a very similar price to Microsoft's new Xbox Series S, and it got me thinking, can this system compete with Microsoft's weaker console? Now, I'd advise taking this video with a whole ocean of salt, not just a pinch of salt, because I didn't build this thing to compete directly with the Series S, as at the moment that seems to be pretty much impossible. Prices on the used market and the new market are inflated. I mean, it's very hard to get a component at recommended retail price currently, at least here in the UK, unless you are opting for lower end stuff. I mean, GT 1030s and RX 550s are still at a sensible price, but they're going to struggle to game in 2020. So yeah, I didn't build this system to compete with the Series S. This is just a system that happens to be of a similar price to the new console that took me a while to put together from used and one new part. So let's talk about that. In this PC we have an RX 5500 XT, the 4GB version, which could pose a problem already, as well as an i5 4460. Again, this could be problematic due to the lack of hyper-threading, but hopefully when we crank things up to 1440p, more load will be placed on the GPU and the CPU won't struggle as much, but we'll find all that out in a little bit. Can this system, which cost roughly the same as the Series S, actually compete with it? I wouldn't be bringing you this video if I didn't think that prices will soon start to come back down to normal. Again, I think at some point in the very near future you'll be able to find these parts like the 5500 XT on the new market again for closer to £150 here in the UK, or the recommended retail price in the US, or the respective equivalent currency depending on where you live. I think prices will drop. I think they're just really high at the moment because a lot of people are still stuck indoors buying PC components. The new consoles have just come out, new hardware's just come out, and everything seems to be all over the place, especially considering Christmas too. Prices always go up around then. So yeah, a mixture of all these things just has caused carnage on both the new and used markets. Before I get started, let's quickly pause here. You're probably wondering how I built this PC for this price, and believe it or not, there was a time when parts were well priced and the 5500 XT was in stock. So that was the most expensive thing. I bought that new. I bought a couple of these. This one was new for about 150, and the rest sort of made up the price buying things on eBay. This PC has less cores and less VRAM than the Series S, and honestly the console does seem to represent better value for money right now than a PC build could at an identical price. A new build, that is. It's just the way it is. In terms of used parts, well, they differ even more depending on where you live, so again you'd be hard pressed to build something at the same Series S price point, but like my machine, you could build something that still has somewhat of an upgrade path. This machine, while it has an i5 4460, could be upgraded to an i7 later on, which would seriously help it out, but it would cost a little more. 16GB of RAM could also be added for a bit more money. In its current state, this system is a good place to start. So let's talk about the performance. This system can do 1080p 30fps and 1080p 60fps just fine, with the former allowing higher settings. But as we know, the Series S settings aren't that straightforward, and this brings us on to the comparative gameplay. It's early days for Microsoft's budget machine, so future games may really start to make better use of this hardware. In fact, I might continue comparing future releases on the Series S to the performance of this PC to see how things change and develop over time. For now, let's talk about trying to match the console. I'm talking similar visuals and frame rates. We'll continue with Forza Horizon 4, which has received a performance patch for the new X and S consoles. On the Series S, Forza runs at 1920 by 1080 and targets 60 frames per second. With our aging, well, apart from the graphics card PC, I used a mixture of high and ultra to try and get a nice combination of performance and graphical quality, and safe to say that the game not only looked good but ran with over 60 frames per second as well. Jumping into gameplay this time with everything cranked up to ultra, and we still saw at least 60 FPS, but there were some drops which would lead me to recommend or suggest keeping most things at high and not ultra. So it's not a bad start, but let's move on to a more demanding release, and one that runs with a dynamic 1920 by 1080 at 30 frames per second on the Series S. It's also worth noting that the Series S has ray tracing here, whereas this machine does not support it. I myself don't really care too much about that, but it's worth mentioning for the sake of comparison. Because we've got a lower frame rate to compete with in Watch Dogs Legion, I decided that again I was going to try and get this game looking as good as possible, while also attempting to retain at least 30 frames per second on the PC. The first step was to run the benchmark test, which gave us our average and percentile numbers. We saw at least 40 frames per second overall, but I wouldn't recommend using the very high or ultra settings. The 4460 will also spike to 100% usage occasionally as well, because this is a game that's quite hard on processors. The frame dips picked up in the benchmark are more noticeable during actual gameplay, that's for sure, but the frame rate stayed above 30 most of the time. Remember that the console resolution is dynamic and our PC resolution is not. A dynamic resolution on the Series S helps to prevent these dips, but on PC the only alternative is to lower things to 900p, or in this case, lock the game to exactly 30 FPS if you want to keep the graphical quality, because we don't actually have to lower things here in order to maintain this frame rate. Locking the game to 1080p 30 FPS is the best way to play on this system, I think, and I found that there were still some dips to the high 20s, but overall it's not too bad. There might still be a 60 FPS patch which might improve things on the Series S, but not without taking a further hit to resolution. And speaking of which, let's move on to Assassin's Creed Valhalla. So I'm calling this a dynamic 1440p Series S game, but the resolution actually goes both higher and lower than 1440p in its quest to maintain a near solid 30 FPS. There is also a 60 FPS performance mode that was recently added with a patch, but using it means a base resolution of just 720p on the console. This does actually go a bit higher when less is happening on screen. I think that's fair enough, and I'd happily welcome the inclusion of a 60 FPS mode in every game, just so that people have a choice. Let's talk about 1440p on the PC first. Again, we can't do dynamic, and running at full fat 1440p renders the game nearly unplayable. The frame rate is just too low to put up with, though that's just my personal taste. I like to see a minimum of 30 FPS with third-person games. However, we are running at high detail, and dropping things to low would certainly push our average way up, which is worth bearing in mind. In fact, all of today's games should do at least 30 FPS with 1440p if you don't mind those lower presets, but I wanted to try and compete not only frame rate wise with the Series S, but visually as well. Because we don't have dynamic resolution available, I chose to use 80% of 1440p this time around, which is 2048 by 1152, and this is where we saw a jump, still with the high settings, to at least 30 FPS. This performance sort of translates to real-world gameplay, though there are more frame dips in demanding areas, and I noticed one cutscene in particular that dropped to around 19. All I did was talk to someone, there was literally nothing else going on screen. Just like in Watch Dogs, locking the frame rate will help, and the game should therefore be playable with high settings at 2048 by 1152 with 30 frames per second a lot of the time. But let's talk about that performance mode. The Series S has a 60 FPS mode that drops the game to 720p, though it does go higher in quieter areas. Digital Foundry have a great video on it. 720p 60 FPS is also achievable on this PC of course, but it's not dynamic, so sticking with 720p all the time seems a bit pointless as our hardware is going to waste. I think 900p with the high settings is actually a better option, though this will incur drops to the mid-40s in busier areas, but it will stay stable in the wilderness or out of town places. The map is very big and performance changes quite a bit depending on where you are. To finalise then, let's talk about Black Ops Cold War. It's a dynamic 1440p once again here on the Series S with a 60 FPS frame rate in mind. Slapping everything on low with our PC will make that a more realistic target of 1440p once again, but the game suffers visually. It all depends, to be honest, on how you want to experience things. That's the beauty of PC gaming. If you like fancier visuals, then whack the settings right up, but if you prefer as many frames as possible, turn everything way down. Again, I've tried to maintain a nice level of detail that sits in combination with a smooth frame rate. Medium settings with high textures allows our system to hit at least 30 FPS with some spikes above 40 and closer to 50, but all it takes to retain this detail and get closer to 60 FPS is a drop, once again, to 2014 by 1144, or 2014 by 1144. It's just higher than 1080p and a bit lower than 1440p. This makes the game look sharper than 1080p, yet the performance isn't really affected because honestly our CPU is maxing out at either resolution. There are drops to the mid-40s during particularly action-packed cutscenes and in-game moments, but I'd deem this pretty playable overall. Again, you can always drop the detail or resolution on PC. This PC I feel would still make for a decent 1080p gaming machine in its current state, though as I said before, if you want a higher resolution then switching to 16GB of RAM and an i7 would help out. An 8GB version of a 5500 XT would also benefit this machine as well, or a 5600 XT, but then we'd be way over the price point that I intended to hit. To conclude, it's early days and I'll be testing performance of this machine as new games come out, but one thing is for sure, both the Series S and well-priced PC parts are very difficult to come by at the moment. I think for the money, Microsoft's new entry-level gaming machine is fantastic, but I also think that building a PC, even if it can't quite match the console performance-wise, is still a good idea because it can be upgraded over time to something that can. So there we go. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I spent quite a while on it because I was trying to find the best settings on PC, ones that sort of looked remotely close to the Xbox Series S settings, things like that. Nothing's going to be exact here, but I hope you've enjoyed this nonetheless. If you did, leave a like on it down below. Leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.